Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Bonney and Reverend Dr. Jayme Matthias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Bonney.
And for this episode, we're excited to welcome a special guest, Reverend Trish.
Well, I'm really delighted to introduce all of you to my friend and colleague in ministry and a very important leader in the Twin Cities, Dr. Julia Nerbonne. I met Julia a while back, and her coalition of faith leaders came across my radar as I began to get more and more concerned about a natural area in Minnesota called the Boundary Water. So for those of you who don't know this, we have this absolutely precious, pristine national wilderness at the north of Minnesota. It bumps up against another precious natural wilderness called the Quetico in Canada. And as I began getting concerned about developing plans for that, I found Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light and signed up for their email list and wanted to know what they were doing. And they have been a very important voice on all different kinds of climate issues in Minnesota, in our Twin Cities region, but very much beyond that. And one of the things I admire about Julia and all of the colleagues that work with her is they have been unabashed in trying to claim some of the moral high ground around planetary care of creation, which is, fundamental to who we say we are as Christians. So, Julia, I'm really excited to welcome you. Julia and I spent a week together with many activists from Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light out at the Standing Rock Reservation when there was a call to clergy around the United States to rally and come out and bring the moral force of their witness to that situation around protecting the waters of the reservation. So just really glad to have you with us. And I'm sure there's some things that you would like to add, Julie, about who you are and what you do. You could even give us an even better snapshot of what your coalition does for us.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for having me on. It's such a privilege to be able to talk a little bit about the work that we're passionate about. As you know, my name is Julia, and I have been working with this wonderful organization called Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. I started as an executive director back in 2013, and at that time, the climate movement was sort of new. People weren't really talking about climate change as a sort of cutting edge social justice issue. And we have a broad mission of trying to bring communities of faith from across Minnesota to this critical conversation about what are our values surrounding this precious planet that we live on, and how are we going to, as faith actors, take action in the face of what really is shaping up to be quite a crisis. I had been involved with a group called Minnesota 350, and maybe you all have heard about 350.org, but 350 parts per million is the sort of amount of carbon in the atmosphere that one would need to get back down to in order to make sure that we have a stable, livable planet, the planet that we sort of would recognize, the planet that the three of us were born onto. And so Dr. James Hansen basically said, this is the red line. And Trish, I'm wondering, have you been following it? Do you know what the parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere are right now?
No, I don't, and I'd love you to fill us in.
Boy, I wish I had actually gone online and gotten you a current number, but it's somewhere over 420 parts per million. When we started this work back in 2010, it was 392. And to give some context, it was 350 in 1989 when I graduated from high school. So anyway, I realize here I am coming on this podcast and talking about numbers, and this really isn't about numbers. It's about this incredible place we wake up to every morning. We have a basic belief that the sun is going to rise and the moon will come out at night, that we will have winter and we will have summer, and that we can grow excited in the winter to be planting our seeds, and that we can cultivate them and eat delicious fruit from the land, that we can do this in community. There's so many beautiful things about this place that we live. And to think that because of human decisions that we would put all of that at risk is heartbreaking. So anyway, I believe that faith actors have a lot to say about that.
Dr. Nerbonne, what a delight to have you with us today. You mentioned your graduation from high school. Tell us about your academic background, because I'm especially interested in how it is that you transitioned from academia, from the academic sciences, into climate organizing and climate advocacy. And I know that persons like myself who are hearing about Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light for the first time we are on the edges of our seats waiting to hear about this organization and why it matters now.
Okay, so two questions. First of all, how did I get into this from an academic career? And then what do we actually do? I will answer both of those questions. Um, I grew up again loving trees, lakes, rivers. I remember when I was a child, we had a tree house in our yard, and I used to seek solace in that place and go up in the branches. And if I had a bad day at school, it was a place that held me. It was home to me. One time I went away on a summer trip, and I came home, and I didn't know that this was happening, but the lot next door to me where this tree was located was slated for development, and somebody had cut this tree down. Um, and I don't know if you guys have a moment in your life where you remember that sort of thing, but as a 11 or 12-year-old, I was totally devastated. And I sort of made it my life's mission to be looking out for these, relatives, whether it was a squirrel or a tree or a forest. So I went to school. I studied both biology and religion as an undergrad. Um, I fought to protect. When I graduated from college, I went to Vassar College in New York, and there's a wonderful theology program there. Um, and people kept asking me, "Are you going to be biology and religion because you're going to be a bioethicist?" I was like, not really. It's about this bigger natural world. And so I went and worked at an Episcopal school. I taught ethics, and at some point they were going to be cutting down this virgin forest in order to sell off this land so that they could build a biology building. And I was like, this something is wrong about this situation. And that was where I first started learning about organizing. Like, let's figure out how to put a list of people together. It turns out I had all these students and all these parents who were really, like with me on this. And we basically took this to the board and to the principal. And this thing was ultimately stopped. Now, I don't know if it was, my good doing or a bigger force of many organizers from many places. I think that's the answer. But that felt really powerful. The part of the story I sometimes haven't told in the past is that 2 years later, I ended up leaving that school under somewhat terrible circumstances. They sort of took my job and made it smaller, and whatever. They basically ran me out of the school. So there's consequences to organizing. But you gotta do it for the trees. Um, I went to graduate school in conservation biology, and I thought I was going to be a biologist. And after spending time in my master's program counting all of these incredible creatures that lived under the water, they were like macroinvertebrates. Um, I loved doing it, and I loved sort of understanding the mystery of the natural world. But I realized that I didn't want to spend my whole life cataloging the decline of these beautiful spaces. And I had had a taste of organizing. So I thought, let's figure out how to be how to answer that question of how we can actually get humans to behave themselves. It was clear that it was really the humans that were the problem and not, the ecosystems. They weren't falling apart all on their own. So I became a student of social movements, and I studied conservation biology with a focus on social movements in my PhD program. So that's a little bit about me. And now you want to know about Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light.
We do. So for those of us, I'm here in Austin, Texas, Julia. So we're a bit farther from Minnesota, but just the very name, Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me all about it.
Well, it is a delicious name, and I give full credit to an old colleague, Sally Bingham, and they started a national organization. It was called Interfaith Power and Light, and so there's a network of organizations across the country that are part of this broader network. Um, and I just love it because it's a place where we can build power. And of course, in order to solve climate change, you need to build renewable energy systems and, literally shift the way that we get literal power. But more importantly, I think we need to build the power of the people. So we have power, and of course, light is both, you are in a religious space. What is the light of the world, right? It's the ideas, it's the heart, it's the insight that we have. Because if we're going to turn this problem around, it's going to take a total transformation. That's going to take, 8 billion beautiful ideas. So I love Minnesota Interfaith. We work with people of all faiths, power and light. Um, so this organization was founded in 2004, and I was able to come in 2013. And when I got to MNIPL, it was, one half-time position. They had a $30,000 annual budget. Um, I was absolutely passionate about climate change and climate justice, and I really want to get into that. But at the time, it was like, how are we going to get the global community to agree on how to curb our carbon emissions? And I was really excited about Bill McKibben and his work, and just desperate to bring people in Minnesota together so we could change the law of the land and make sure that, at least in Minnesota, that we were taking this threat seriously. And so that's sort of what we do. We work with faith communities. We have over 400 faith communities. Um, we help them to bring, sometimes they're called green teams, sometimes they're social action teams. We coach people, we help people to find out what their power and their light is. We inspire them to be really creative, but also really disciplined about creating campaign plans. And we help them connect with other people so they're not doing the work alone. And so I guess I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think, it seems to me, Julia, that we're really in an era of a new need for, and I think for many of us, a new appreciation of the power of community organizing, particularly as our government is making a lot of changes that are going to require the rising up of the voices of the people to push back. We certainly saw that here in Minnesota. And my mind, as you were talking, went to the years that Al Gore was like this lone voice crying out in the wilderness, saying the planet's heating, we need to do something, climate change. And the rhetoric was so filled with disinformation and and kind of a he said, well, it was really kind of a he said, not even a he said, she said thing about, is this real? Is it not real? And of course, you just gave us like the numbers do matter. The numbers are one of the ways we get, people's attention. But I'd love you to start sharing with us, as somebody who's a faith leader of a small Catholic community, that, what would you want the folks in the pews to know about what the difference between talking about climate change versus climate justice actually is? Because we're in a tradition as Catholics where every year we have a special place to read the creation story. at our holiest prayer of the year in the Triduum, we on Holy Saturday, we read the creation story as, fundamental to our self-understanding. And yet, all, 364 other days, we're not really thinking very much, I don't think, about what is our relationship with the creation and what are we going to do. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts about climate justice and what people need to be thinking about.
Yeah, one of the invitations that you gave me when you invited me to come and be in conversation with you was that, in this age of, fighting for democracy and all of the troubles that we have in 2026, um, people are not talking as much about climate change, right? And so the question is, have people forgotten? Is this just, it used to be a niche issue and now people have moved on to, you know, immigration reform, et cetera. And I always think that it's really dangerous to think about climate change as the issue, right? It's not actually climate change. It's that we as humans have chosen a way that centers greed and centers, human vanity and really is pursuing the wealth for some at the expense of many. All of the things that Jesus came into our midst in order to confront. I mean, those are all the same problems that we have today. And so climate change is just one part of that story, right? Like, how could we take this incredibly precious planet that God has created and given us and uh, and desecrate it so that we can have a small number of, hyper wealthy people become more wealthy? Like that's the question. And whether that's a question about how we treat our brothers and sisters who are laboring in the farm fields, or whether it has to do with the way that we treat the boundary waters, or I read a story about a, last of its kind butterfly that just went extinct. And of course, we're in an era of great mass extinction. So, do we think about each of those creatures as God's creatures, or do we think of them as something that is simply in the way of a data center development? The question is not about climate change. It's about, how we value each other and how we, value this place that we call home. Um, so I think it's really incredibly important for us to get our values straight. And once we do that, all of the things are gonna come into line. It's about a great transformation of the way that we value each other and how we're going to live together to protect it. And some of that is going to require sacrifice, but a lot of it is going to be, in joyful community.
Julia, you mentioned fields and you mentioned data centers. I often say that I come from the cornfields of Ohio to the corn tortillas of Texas. So this weekend I was back in the middle of the cornfields of Ohio, and I could not believe that one of our neighbors in the middle of the cornfields had a sign in their front yard saying no data centers. And Reverend Trish and I recently had a guest on this podcast who was speaking about the environmental impact of data centers and just the real, the amount of water and all the resources, the natural resources that it takes behind those. So I'm really glad to hear you speak to that issue. But my question is this now, Julia. In the Catholic tradition, we are celebrating this year the 800th anniversary of the passing of Saint Francis of Assisi, who is known as the patron saint of ecology. And so for many of us, when we think of climate justice and climate related issues, we tend to think of them as maybe political issues and or as scientific issues. But I think that y'all are onto a tremendous insight into the very spiritual dimensions of this. Wondering if you might be able to speak a bit more about the spiritual aspects of caring for our sister Mother Earth, as St. Francis called her.
I am thinking about St. Francis and, what was he? He was a rich man who decided to change his life, right? And that's actually what we need people to be doing right now. All of us are rich, right? We're very wealthy. I have, I drive a car, I have a house. Am very privileged to be able to, fly around the country. And yet the times in which I am most grounded might be when I'm sitting on the back porch with an egg that came from the chickens that are just a few meters from me, and enjoying a cup of coffee in that place that is, a grounded home for me. So I think, when we think about um, getting back to like the most human experience, it's that relationship with the land. And that's why there's such a, big buzz around, wellness and meditation and reconnecting. And I mean, I think that's all really important. But I think that at the end of the day, what we are, um, what we are dazzled by, and again, this is related to data centers, and we're dazzled by the sort of the technology of the world, and yet the place that we're the most human is when we are in touch with our bodies and with the earth that has created those bodies. um, so I don't know, I'm trying to think about Saint Francis. I mean, he left his wealthy home and went to the forest and became in relationship with not just birds and foxes, right? But also with the people of those places. And I think that that is a homecoming, or a calling for us as modern people.
I think we're so blessed here in Minnesota and actually all over the United States. I mean, this country is pretty glorious in terms of its natural environments everywhere. I was born in the Bronx and raised in northern New Jersey, and everyone loves to diss New Jersey. But New Jersey has some a magnificent lakes region. It has a spectacular shoreline. It was the Garden State because it was the food producer for a big chunk of the Northeast. It was just, it's actually a very beautiful place. And I feel that way about Minnesota, that in our cities, we just have to walk a few blocks and we see these gorgeous lakes. And up north, we have all of our towering pine trees. And, so that sense of the preciousness of the earth for me, happens, like you said, Julie, when I get out in it, right? When I'm out there. For me, it very much when I go up north, it's definitely one of those holy places for me. But what do you think about, how we could encourage? So Jayme and I both lead congregations. A lot of people who listen to this talk will lead congregations. How do we help people get in touch with the value of the natural world in a society where we commodify everything? We don't, like my dad grew up, eating kidneys and all these organ meats because they were very poor. Um, and, someone would slaughter the hog and it used every single snippet of that thing, right? For me, I'm just going into Cub Foods and grabbing pork chops, right? Everything is packaged and sanitized, and I'm very out of touch with the chain that brings that to me. And so I'm just wondering what have you found as you've worked with congregations is important in terms of the kinds of conversations we have to be having with folks to help them get back in touch with the sacredness of the planet and everything that's dwelling on it?
All right, well, I'm going to do just a little organizing 101 about how to
Good.
think about it. So we think about a three-legged stool. And we ask each congregation that's developing a climate justice congregational action plan to think about three things. What is something very practical that is going to, help them build, grow, do something very tangible that will both combat the climate crisis, but also maybe nourish our bodies. So put in a garden, do a something very tangible, like be involved in making a meal for somebody. Practical, right? So practical leg of the stool. The second leg of the stool is the systemic leg. So while it's wonderful for us to be able to grow a garden or to put solar panels on our roof, sometimes we don't have access to that because we don't have money, we don't have permission from the state. We haven't created the environment that will make it possible for us to do that. So we need to work on systemic change. So, international climate action. In Minnesota, we have a law now that says that by 2040, we're going to have 100% clean renewable electricity. That was something that I know you worked on that, Trish. People across Minnesota, congregations across Minnesota worked for 5 years to get that bill passed. Such holy work. So systemic change. Fighting pipelines, Line 3, the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock, going out and saying, we are not going to let this, these billionaires crush our communities and our planet on our watch. So we're going to change the system. We're going to, say no to this. And then the third kind of action that we ask people to identify and write out a plan for is how they're going to deepen their spiritual commitment and their relationships. Every group, every congregation that makes a plan has to have one, at least one example of a practical, a systemic, and a relational or spiritual change that they're going to make. And this prevents people from saying, well, our congregation just, we just pray about this problem, right? We want people to pray about it, right? But thoughts and prayers are not going to change the system, right? We need people to go to the Capitol and say no to a pipeline moving through our neighborhood, no to a data center being built in our state. But we also need people to have that tangible experience of the practical. For example, we have a congregation in St. Paul, a Catholic congregation, and they have a practical goal of getting solar panels on their roof. Actually, I'm going to talk about Pax Christi in Eden Prairie. They had a practical goal of having a solar array. So we work with them to get a community solar array. And they now have that. They're producing solar for, dozens of households and for their congregation. But we weren't satisfied with having them stop there. We said, well, join us in this movement to make sure that we can make community solar available for all congregations. So we had a team of people from their congregation come down to the Public Utilities Commission and tell the story of their solar array, how they were producing solar for neighbors, how they didn't have a credit score requirement to be part of the array, that they were really working on equity in their city, and that after that they were able to actually bring people together to ribbon cut, pray, celebrate the spiritual dimension of making that moral commitment. So that's just an example of one Catholic community and their three-legged stool.
Julia, I'm so glad to hear of these really concrete ways in which we as faith communities can be advocating for greater climate justice. I know here at Holy Family, for instance, we have the blue recycling containers, and anytime I see someone toss a plastic bottle into a trash can to go to the landfill rather than into a recycling bin, there is something inside me that just screams that laments how it is that sometimes we don't see the impact of our actions on Sister Mother Earth. My question, though, for you, Julia, deals with the intersection that I'm very interested with is the intersection between environmental justice with racial justice and economic justice and indigenous rights. And I'm just wondering if you might give us some perspective on who it is that tends to bear the greatest burden with respect to climate change and environmental issues, and why it is that this matters to people of faith, people of various faiths, and people of no faith tradition at all.
All right, well, I'm going to actually just dive right into the example you started with, and then we'll build on that. Let's just talk about recycling for a second. First of all, I think recycling is terribly boring, right? I think of my grandfather used to say, everybody needs to have, money is like toilet paper. You have to have it, but you don't want to talk about it. So anyway, I think that recycling is like toilet paper. Like every responsible person needs to have toilet paper in their bathroom. They need to have recycling bins. We should do that, right? But it's actually, I think that there's a couple of interesting elements to it that I want to dive into. First of all, I like to get people to think about practical action as a spiritual practice, right? You're not going to change the climate crisis by having a recycling bin, right? Like that's not like there's a whole bunch of people who are working on this like micro personal action, but they don't want to deal with anything else. Like we have to think in a much bigger sort of frame to really understand climate justice. But I still think that recycling is important, right? Because at the end of the day, we need to live like if you talk all day long about the theory of loving one another and then you end up cheating your neighbor, it's anyway, the bottom line is that you have to live in concert with your values, and so little actions equal sort of bigger messages. And so we do love helping people to make sure that they've got their recycling sorted out. But I actually think that recycling is actually a much bigger issue, right? Because at the end of the day, I don't know, I'm just sort of connecting the dots like one of those little string um, games. But the question is, where does that recycling go, right? What's the bigger context of where that plastic bottle, will go when it's in the trash? In Minnesota, it actually goes to a trash incinerator, which is in a low-income neighborhood in Minneapolis, and it's in downtown Minneapolis. It's right next to North Minneapolis, where there's like the highest rates of poverty and the highest rates of asthma. It's also got the most highways. And the highest proportion of non-white residents in the state. And so you ask yourself the question, so we're going to take this plastic bottle and now it's going to get burned in the herc, and that, the dioxins that come from that are going to be polluting people in that town. People don't necessarily know that story, right? They don't connect the dots between their plastic bottle and the health of their neighbors. So I think it's important for people to understand that. But when people do recycling, they also need to be asking the question, what kind of systemic movement can I be part of that will sort of address the racial inequities, the sort of the systemic redlining that has happened in this city that would make this one place be the place where the incinerator was located? It's not an accident. It happens in every city in this country, that the polluting industries are in the places where people don't have the power to say no. And it's actually been quite an issue. We passed this beautiful 100% bill in Minnesota in 2023. 100% of our stuff is going to come from clean, renewable electricity. Clean, except there's a provision that was written in that they're saying that actually incineration can be called clean because it's theoretically renewable, right? Because people continue to create trash, right? So there's all these little loopholes that are being built in. So we're still at the Public Utilities Commission every year, making sure that we remind them of what their real commitment is.
You're just reminding me, Julia, of the need to constantly ask the next right question, right? So, I remember the first Earth Day because I'm that old, and that was the beginning of people even thinking about recycling. And I went for decades not really asking myself the question, what happens to this stuff after it leaves my house? Just didn't think very much about it. And I just presumed out of my privilege that somehow the city was doing the right thing and getting that, those bottles were getting, reused, it's melted down and reused in some way, not incinerated, right? So it's for me, it's also like, what is the next question on things like our how we purchase things and what our trash footprint ends up being. Like it was just about 2 years ago out here in the suburbs, and I know some neighbors who are really pissed off about this. We all have the option to compost now. And you have to pay for it whether you use it or not, which people think is incredibly unfair, right? But when we started doing it, Pete and I were just shocked at how our trash footprint dropped, by creating this other bin of stuff that was going to get composted. So I'm wondering though, what's there for me. I'm just fessing up to my own um, ignorance and my own inertia around some of these questions. What are the obstacles you've seen, particularly among privileged people, in terms of really letting in the need for their action. What are those things that keep us, from being willing to have the right kinds of conversations and ask the right kinds of questions?
Wow. Well, my first question is, what are the right kinds of conversations and the right kinds of questions? I think we are a society that is really struggling to find out who we are. And maybe the right kinds of questions aren't about where, I mean, I think everybody needs to be asking the micro questions about where things are going and how am I living and all those questions. I think that that's part of being a whole human, is knowing who you are and what you're, you know, being built out of. Literally, like if I don't know where my food comes from, I'm not going to know what my body is made of. Um, but but I think that we actually have some deeper questions to answer right now. Um, and and I don't have a lot of answers, but I just wanted to throw out a thought. Um, I think that people are looking for a big answer, we have such a sort of hierarchical society. We depend on parents taking care of children, and we're going to have a city that provides the answer to your question about where the recycling goes, and I mean that's like human society, right? It's important that we have structures that we don't have to be thinking about everything in our own little brain. But I think that there is a sort of fairly Eurocentric worldview that's about sort of we're going to solve problems with one big answer. And I encourage people to think instead about a million Noahs, a million arks, right? Like climate change is going to be solved one little lot at a time with trees, for example. I love the example of people trying to create these technologies that have carbon capture, and there are these posts that go up, and then there are these like metal rods that come out of them, and each of the metal rods is going to sequester carbon. It's going to suck the carbon in. And I'm thinking to myself, that sounds awfully familiar. I was like, right outside my door, I have this tree, and it's like rooted to the ground. It doesn't need to be put there with cement. And every one of its branches is going to be creating leaves that are going to sequester carbon. We have these things in our midst all over the place. And we can be sort of reacquainting ourselves with the natural processes that already serve us. And we can be building the little solution in the place that we have control over. And we have 8 billion creative people on this planet who, if they were able to, could be investing in, um, you know, creating, their own micro space that is, answering the big questions. And some of that has to do with climate and mitigation. Some of it has to do with answering the micro questions about how am I going to, when I'm tired after work, find kindness for somebody who annoys me, right? How am I going to build a community on this block that I live in, even though my neighbor across the street really annoys me? Right? Like, how am I going to, even though it feels really scary, I'm going to go out and if I hear whistles down the block, show up to be able to protect my neighbors, right? Like, those are just little questions that deal with my tiny world. And I feel like part of the work of getting people to a place where they feel like spiritually and mentally strong enough to do that is actually coming into contact with the not only the gratitude that we feel for what we have, but also the grief of what we are losing and what we see around us. So if you know of the work of Joanna Macy, who wrote a book called the work that it's Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston wrote a book called The Work That Reconnects. And there's another book called Active Hope that they've written. And they have this cycle that they ask people to think about as they're doing sort of workshops. But I think it works for me on a sort of very individual basis. Like if you wake up in the morning and you start with gratitude, you're orienting yourself towards this incredible gift that we have in that, being part of God's creation. And then the next part of that cycle is saying, I am going to name and allow myself to feel grief for the world that is broken. And, that may be, grief for the fact that my neighbor is inside their house and unable to go out, right? And that's like that's just simply like wrong, and it causes me to feel despair, and it's okay for me to cry and to feel and to name that grief. Um, but then the next step is that you have to make space to like have insight. And I'm not going to get all the steps. There's 7 steps, but basically you have to have um, you have to have gratitude. You have to name the harm, and then from that, you basically have released the creativity that gives you the ability to see things with new eyes. And by seeing things with new eyes, I can be like, wow, my neighbor is in the house right now and she's really upset, but like, her daughter and I are dancing. I wonder what it would look like to have a dance party, right? And then you could just create little micro solutions that will help us to. And I feel like we don't need to be just talking about climate change all day long. I think that one of the problems with early climate activists is that they were just like, all you people are so dumb because you don't see that we're all going to die. And therefore, like, and what people did is that they ran in the other direction. Right. So instead, if we said, start where you are, what do you feel grateful for? You feel grateful for this faith community that somebody brought brownies on Sunday morning. Awesome. Like, let's be grateful for that. And let's be grateful for the hug that we got from a neighbor or a child who, we didn't know. And let's be grateful that the public bus, has just taken me to my location or whatever. Like, start with gratitude. And then we can figure out what are we mourning? And it's not appropriate for MNIPL to be writing emails that say to our base right now, don't worry about the, metro surge and the ice invasion. Instead, you should worry about climate change, right? If we do that, what we're not doing is honoring where people's real grief is in that moment. And so, I feel like if we can get people to really engage that empowerment through that, like really looking at both what we're grateful and what we're feeling grief about, we can, at the moment in which the issue becomes, the data center, people are ready to go because they've built relationships around the potluck to protect their neighbors. So it's not a one-stop issue, right? It's an issue of how do we become more human so that we can see all the different types of pain that are around us.
Julia, I love that image that you use of going from gratitude to, say, organizing a dance party. I think one of my questions is a springboard from that, and that is the whole question of how Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light speaks about this sort of three-legged stool of helping people find action that is authentic and effective and energizing. And your work focuses heavily on organizing and leadership development. My PhD is in leadership studies. I'm just wondering if you might be able to share with our listeners some of the insights that you've gained as to what it is that motivates ordinary people to become active, effective, energized agents of change.
Okay, well, I'll start by saying everybody has been part of that meeting that doesn't really have a purpose or a structure, right? So you're called into the green team meeting, and Joe is working on the recycling bins, and somebody else is planning a march, and somebody else is like, these are all good things, right? But like everybody's like kind of doing their own thing, and there's no real reason to be meeting, right? And you're not building towards a vision that's bigger than the collective of each of your parts. You're just sort of informing people, like serial information, whatever. Um, what we try to train people to do is think about, like, first of all, what are the shared stories that we are like if everybody's coming together for a shared purpose, identifying what it is that we are going to work on and what our goals are is part of being effective organizers or change makers. I mean, this is all coming from the work of Marshall Gans and the New Organizing Institute. You've got to get a shared story. You've got to figure out who's with you. So, I send people out to do a bunch of one-to-ones so that they can figure out, this is a wonderful person. We've decided we're going to have potlucks together with our families, but like their interests and skills is this, my interests and skills is this. There's not there's not an overlap. So let's, honor the power that we have, and we don't have to be in the same meeting, right? Everybody doesn't have to work together. So we start with finding our shared narrative, going out and collecting people who also finding our own narrative, going out and working with people who share that narrative. And then we need to have some sense of a shared structure. So, sometimes that's just like we're going to have a meeting every third Wednesday. And, and at those meetings, we're going to structure it in this way. And we have a sense of what the norms of the group are. And we've decided what our, shared priorities are. By having the safety of knowing what's going to happen and having things be predictable, people can bring their best thinking to that shared goal. Which gets to the next point, which is that you can get together every Wednesday, and if nobody agrees about the strategy that you're going to use to get to your goal, it can end up just being like an exercise in frustration. So you've got to have enough discipline to agree on the way that you're going to go about something. I sometimes liken this to if you have there's a boulder in the middle of your churchyard, and you need to remove the boulder. And you have one group of people who's out there trying to raise money to hire a company to remove it. And another group of people is training all of the people in the community to like lift weights so that they can lift it themselves, right? And another group of people is trying to redesign the churchyard so that the boulder doesn't have to be moved, right? And then they all get together, they're just going to be like mad at each other, right? Because they're working at cross purposes. So instead, you have to, create the space and give the time so that you can come up with a shared strategy on how to do it. And sometimes that involves working with outside actors. So, MNIPL was very passionate about having 100% renewable electricity. But we had to work with actors from across the spectrum of environmental and social justice groups. We had to work with tribes. We had to work with, faith communities. We had to work with environmental groups who maybe didn't share all of our sort of left of center ideas about environmental justice. All of us had to work together in order to get it across the finish line. So knowing who the allies are that you need to be recruiting is a really important part of being successful. And I would say, for a faith community, I've seen faith communities be really effective when they know that they are part of something bigger than just their little community. Trish, we started by going up to Standing Rock. MNIPL brought faith communities, dozens of faith communities went and were in solidarity with Indigenous community actors who were working on blocking the next pipeline, which is called Line 3. And so we would organize people to go up and to meet with and to bring their signs and to protest this pipeline that was coming in. They weren't going to have the ability to do that all on their own. They needed to have an invitation, and they needed to have some instructions about how to do that in a good way. They needed Julia to be in touch with the sheriff in the area to make sure that they didn't stand in a place that was going to endanger their elders. Having some context about how you can fit into a movement and being a little bit humble about your own role, I think, is an important part of being part of a sort of a multi-faith movement for justice.
Yeah, and I think, the fact that so many of the most effective coalitions that are really speaking a call for a moral voice are in our state multi-faith, right? That I think of Isaiah, Minnesota. We've had folks on the podcast from them. I think about what you're doing, and that we're very plural, and we can stand together, sort of shoulder to shoulder on core values. And one of the things that really struck me during Metro Surge was it was like I've been talking about MNIPL and Isaiah, Minnesota for 9 years. And I could not get anybody to get engaged, it was whatever. But when we hit the crisis of Metro Surge, suddenly people realized that engagement means lots of different things. right? It ranges from person to person. Not everybody is going to be the person in their car following black SUVs and writing down license plates, right? Some people are going to put on a yellow vest and stand at the bus stop and greet the children as they're coming off, right? So it was a really amazing awakening for our community, I felt, on the spectrum of action. Because I think one of the ways people get, fall into the paralysis is feeling like this is just too big. And I can't do what you do. I can't show up at the state capitol and, which, is for me like kind of what you have to do. But, everybody will do their little piece, and it really ties into our Christian understanding of the gifts of the body, right? That gifts are in the body, and we have everything we need. Um, I do think, though, getting aware as a first step of what are your local issues is an important starting point. And I know here in Eden Prairie, one of the things that galvanized people around the environment was the fact that the property around Miller Spring, which is this wonderful, pristine water that many of us were down there with our jugs every week, getting our spring water, was threatened by the development. Well, suddenly lots of people got mobilized. I'm wondering what other kinds of questions, as we come to our end of our time together, what are some first steps that congregational groups can take? What would you suggest people do to begin having meaningful conversations about getting started around these issues? Because you're absolutely right that like we could not have been talking about climate change when we were, dealing with some of what we were dealing with here in our region in the winter. On the other hand, I do have a concern that given there's a new fire every day, that we're also losing track of how critical this issue is. Maybe that comes from having read the novel The Ministry for the Future last summer, which I really suggest everyone get that novel and read it, because if anything will wake you up to how climate collapse can happen, it's this novel. So anyway, Julia.
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you. I mean, the thing about the Ministry for the Future is it starts out with the story of a man who is part of a heat wave in India where most of the people in his community die. And he, like, by act of, sheer will is able to survive, but most of the people didn't. And that is like, that's actually not an unrealistic scenario. So I feel like there is a knowledge gap. People don't understand what this sort of ticking time bomb of climate tipping points really are. If you haven't looked up the word, the AMOC, AMOC, go and look it up on your computer, see what they say about that. This is a tipping point in the ocean currents, where if this ocean current that runs from Greenland down to the Americas and back up, this is how Europe stays a little bit more temperate, and the Americas, South America, is able to cool down. That brings the cold water down and up. If this ocean current stops, Europe is going to be in deep freeze, and we're not going to be able to have agriculture in this area in, large swaths of South America. So knowledge gap. People should get educated. People should be willing to read some books and to understand what's at stake. And part of that is having good practice around gratitude and naming what is concerning, and having some places where we have outlets for, action. Simply being worried about the end of the world without having outlets for taking action is incredibly psychologically damaging.
Mhm.
So, before your congregation just goes into a bunch of, teaching people about climate disaster, what are some good ways that you can join with other people to take action? So certainly, in Minnesota, keep track of what's happening at MNIPL. You're invited to apply to become a resilience hub. If you wanted to have your congregation, Trish, be part of a resilience hub program, we have a year-long program where we do coaching of, hopefully it'll be 10 emerging resilience hub congregations that will learn all about how to invite people in, and how to take action on keeping people safe in an emergency, and how to work to decarbonize and to build a congregation that really combats this sort of disease of social isolation. So, have some concrete opportunities to take action, get people together, bring some structure so that people feel like they know what to expect. I really coach people a lot to be thinking about the leadership of the congregation. If there's a couple of actors who are lay leaders and they don't have the support of campus leadership or of congregational leadership, you end up just having a ton of heartache. So that you need to take the time, move slow enough so you can bring people along. MNIPL does we call it a climate justice conversation. And we start by asking people to think about what really makes them feel connected, what they love, what they feel grateful for. We ask them then to think about the real story about what's happening in climate change, how that's linked to migration, how it's linked to racial justice in this state, how it's linked to the genocide of, Native communities here and across the world. So we ask them to be honest about what's in store for them, and then to be creative, to be thinking about how they can be called through their faith community to take action. So if Jesus turned over the money the money tables in the temple, how could we be doing that? Like, what does that look like in 2026? But we want to hear stories rooted in the faith community that someone is, specifically part of. So we're not telling Catholics to be looking towards Hindu tradition, although it's interesting. You can learn a lot from it. But we're saying, what is it like to be Catholic? And, along the way, we should learn a little bit about, all of the incredible legacy of Catholic liberal thinkers who have changed the world. So,
Julia, we have a tradition here before we share concluding comments of having what we call the Cutting Edge Catholics Questionnaire, which is a series of 12 rapid fire questions where you simply say the first thing that comes to mind, and it allows us to get to know you better. Does that sound like something we might do?
let's give it a try.
This is our Cutting Edge Catholics Questionnaire Climate Edition. Are you ready? First question, Julia. Favorite place in Minnesota?
Lake Itasca and the headwaters of the Mississippi.
Ooh, sunrise or sunset?
Sunset, I'm not a morning person.
Your favorite tree, Julia?
The bur oak or the white pine in close competition.
Julia, one person who inspires you.
My daughter Clara inspires me, and my son Lucas as well. My children are brilliant, and they know a lot that I haven't quite figured out yet.
Awesome. Julia, your favorite season?
Fall.
Your
Yep.
favorite scripture passage related to climate justice?
I'm gonna say for everything there is a season, because I feel like when I think about climate justice, just being in the movement, I can see how, you know, you have to know when to breathe, when to act, when to be in community, when to be angry, you know, when to be compromising. Like there's so many different ways that you have to be to show up, and so I think that that's a passage that has caused me to take a breath sometimes.
Tremendous. The most underrated climate solution.
That it is underrated how important it is to like take care of yourself and your neighbors. That people don't think of that as a climate solution, but I actually think finding out what your real heart says and keeping your heart um, in the game. That's like the first step of being a climate actor.
Yeah. Julia, a book that everyone should read.
That everybody should read. I have like my nerdy books that I I love, but I'm gonna throw out an academic nerdy book.
Mhm.
It's called Thinking in Systems by a woman named Danella Meadows. And I don't necessarily recommend that everybody read this book from cover to cover, but she's absolutely brilliant about thinking through strategic leverage points, and I feel like has opened up my mind in terms of, everybody seems to be rowing in one direction, and she sort of has given me permission to think about, a different way of analyzing a problem. So she's written an article from that book called um, Places to Intervene in a System, and you can find that online. I totally recommend it.
Awesome. What about a habit everyone could start today?
Okay, I'll start by saying I'm a big habit person. I think sometimes in order to be in this terrible, beautiful world, we have to actually sort of gamify our world a little, and you just have to get up and do things. And so I would encourage people to pick, I encourage myself just to pick the next thing and stick with it for a little while. Um, so for me, that has been, I go to a strength class that has been put together by some of my good friends, and um, we do strengthening exercises 2 times a week, and so do something to keep your body strong.
Yeah. Three more questions, Julia. Solar panels or wind turbines?
Solar panels. It's everybody can do it. Even you can even get a solar panel for your balcony and plug it into your home. Not quite yet, but we're working on that legislation in Minnesota. So I think solar panels are a democratizing force.
The most encouraging climate development you've recently seen?
I mean, I just want to say I see people waking up to the oligarchs, right? They're onto them and they haven't been onto them. And so while it's not directly about climate change, I feel like people are waking up and figuring out that we are in this together and that we can't let somebody else dispose of what is precious to us.
And the final question, Julia, what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is when, whether it's myself or my colleagues or my dear friends, when we're able to sort of see how we were both right, but also wrong, and choose to do things differently. Like brave people who are willing to admit that they make mistakes and learn how to heal and how to do better.
Thank you, Julia, for your willingness to participate in our Cutting Edge Catholics Questionnaire Climate Edition. Julia, we've come to the time in our conversation where we tend to share some final words. If you don't mind, I'll jump in first, and then we'll go to Reverend Trish, and then we'll allow you to have the final word for our listeners here today. I just want to say, Julia, I bow my head in your direction to you and all of our friends of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. For me, this is something new that I'm just hearing about for the first time here in Austin, Texas. But there just sounds like a lot of power and a lot of light that's coming from this effort in Minnesota. And so on this 800th anniversary of the passing of St. Francis of Assisi, I'm a Franciscan at heart. I have a Franciscan heart and a deep, deep love for our sister Mother Earth. So for all that you're doing for her and for so many people's, thank you, Julia, you and all our friends at Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. Y'all are absolute heroes. Reverend Trish?
Well, I'm coming away from this conversation very uplifted. And I just had this sense, just hearing you, Julia, and engaging with the questions you've posed and the ideas you offered, that this is doable, that we can do this. And I think that's one of the things that I needed. And I'm really looking forward to having this podcast as a way of re-engaging our community with the question of how do we connect better with this gem that is right here in Minnesota. So I'm just super grateful that you gave us your time and came on. And I speak a lot in my preaching about the power and presence of God pulsing in every one of us and really in every molecule of the creation. And now this is a way to kind of bridge to what do we do to really make active our belief in that. So thanks so much for coming on. But as Jayme said, we always give our guests the last word. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we close out our time together?
I don't know. I want people to be patient with themselves. I want them to recognize what season they're in their own life and their own work. I want people to fight for what they really believe in. Like we are going to need to fight, and things are as bad as they've ever been. And at the same time, we're also awake and aware of all that we love. And so, we'd love to have folks join us across the country. Interfaith Power and Lights are out there, but it doesn't have to be that organization, right? Find something that you care about and do it with your people. And as Frederick Buechner says, like the place that you need to act, or the place that you're called to act, is the where your deep passions meets the world's greatest need, and that couldn't be more true today.
Thank you, Dr. Julia Nerbonne of Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. Our listeners can learn more at mnipl.org. Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jayme Matthias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Vani.
Let's organize for climate justice.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.